Welcome back to We Know Scripted TV, where today we know Dune Prophecy, Season 1, Episode 3, Sisterhood Above All. My name is Grace, but of course I'm not alone. Someone who I actually put above all, it's Taran Armstrong. Taran, how you doing?
You know what, Grace? I was doing better last week.
We got one episode. We got one good. You know what? We'll talk about it. This is a clunky episode, I think, of Dune Prophecy. And while you and I were like, Josh Wigler was like, I think I'm gonna leave Dune. I think I'm gonna go somewhere else. You and I were like, we'll stick around for a bit. And then we got this episode, which I think if we dig real deep, we could find stuff we like, but it is buried beneath a lot of sand, Taran.
Yeah. Last week, I was like, hey, they really, ramped up the pace. They kind of accelerated things in a way I was not expecting. I was like, this is interesting because I don't know what's coming next, And I feel like I feel like I keep experiencing this. Anytime I'm like, what comes next? And I'm excited about it, I'm disappointed because the reason I can't figure out what's coming next is that there isn't anything coming next. That they don't actually have a thing, because I think what we found is that the reason they were able to accelerate so quickly was not because they had so much other cool mysterious stuff to do, but because they planned on slamming the brakes for this episode and basically not advancing the primary plot at all, and instead spending this episode primarily in flashback.
Yeah, I mean, and they slammed on the brakes in the middle of a 6-episode season. It's like we don't have much laneway here, and we spend it going backwards in time in a show that did at the beginning of the show was like, here's all the exposition of all the stuff you need to know before we get to it, and then decided to go and like wade back through it. Was like, actually, we should actually, there's a lot more here to do. It's like, well, then why did you do a long exposition about it? And I have a few things I don't want to, we talked about this a little bit before, that I don't want us to spend however long we're going to talk about this episode just complaining. But what I do think we could try to do is, I think between the two of us can really figure out like why this really felt like it like stuttered, like why it halted again, and why maybe they feel like they had to do that. And I think it does get wrapped up in a little bit of things that, in my opinion, are out of their control. I think that there's probably a version of the story that was the very first version of this that is a very compelling story. And I think a couple things happened. One is, it's so clear to me, Taran, that the entire point of this show is to set up something that is coming in Dune Messiah that was never set up in Dune 1 or Dune 2, because honestly, if you've read the books, it doesn't really happen in the Dune book. It comes, I'd have to like really re-jog my memory there, but they decided not to do it in the movies. So instead they've been like, we could enhance the Dune Messiah movie. And honestly, if when Dune Messiah comes out, we might go back and be like, oh, actually, I'm super glad I watched Dune Prophecy because this thing is happening. But right now, that's an incredibly frustrating point to be in, that I feel like this show is only in service of something that's coming in the future, Taran.
Yeah, and I feel like the thing for me, I think if I were to try to pinpoint this, it's that like the first episode I said was trying to do way too much in a single episode, and what I meant by that was it was trying to set up these characters and these plot points, and it wasn't really doing either one justice. And what I liked about the second episode was that it kind of felt like they were dropping the angle of like, this is a character study, and instead they were just going full force on, here's the plot progression.
We use the
You
voice.
have
The force is from Star Wars. We use the voice here.
This is true.
Mhm.
And they were using like these basic outlines of characters in order to move the plot around. And I was like, okay, I can watch a show that is just plot, because I like, at least they're doing the plot and I'm interested in the mystery. This episode, they went and did the opposite.
Yeah.
And they said, no plot, all character work. And I wouldn't say no plot. There's certainly a twist-ish at the end of the episode, and there's a little bit of story filled in for sure. But I wouldn't say that like there was anything in particular in this episode that I couldn't have inferred from the previous storytelling in any meaningful way. or that I was interested in seeing play out with more depth, because it didn't feel like there was that much more depth. And I just don't think that they are doing the character stuff very well. The second we go back and we have that first flashback scene of like the Harkonnens, and they're just like, you are full of ambition and selfish. I think that we should be ruling the Imperium. And just like, and then we cut back and the brother's dead. And it's like, my brother has been killed by the Atreides. I am going to get revenge for my brother and take over and it's just like, why we're doing clunky dialogue in a flashback. Like, the point of a flashback is that you don't need to do all of the stuff with the dialogue having to do the exposition, but we're doing exposition in the flashback. It's like okay, I just got very frustrated with that.
It is frustrating, and I think that it leads me to like the other thing here is not just that I feel like, and whether this is true or not, but it feels like the show is so hamstrung by being franchise IP. And I don't mean, I mean that in a sense that, like, of course it's a Dune show. Like, of course it's going to have IP stuff, but it is like so IP. It's so like capital H or capital F, franchise doesn't start with an H, capital F franchise IP, that like characters in the show need to have the names Harkonnen and Atreides to like in service of everything we're going to see. But it's quite silly to think that like this 10,000 year feud has to also, that we see in the movies, has to like trace all the way back to this one particular story that we're watching. Because in my mind, there's actually like really, as far as I can tell, there's really no reason why any character should have the name Atreides on this show, other than maybe the killing of a bunch of like there isn't. I don't know if this is starting to make, but like the piece where like the Atreides guy kills the brother, like that wasn't worth showing. They felt like they were like, this isn't the show about the Atreides, it's actually about the Harkonnens. And this is gonna, it sounds convoluted even in my own brain, but I feel like it does feel like these characters could have been named something completely different, and someone came in and took a red pen and was like, nope, that character's last name is now Atreides, and this is actually about Atreides and Harkonnens, and leading all the way up. Whereas like I do think there's like actually some interesting stuff happening in here. The other thing that I feel like they probably were really hamstrung by is the fact that this show does have, I think, like kind of Mark Strong to me is kind of like the most famous person probably in this cast. And if you go down, you probably then get to like Emily Watson, Olivia Williams, and probably Travis Fimmel, all sort of like lingering around. If this show, Taran, had been done,
Mr. Robert Baratheon isn't famous enough.
Well, this is kind of exactly the point that I'm actually going to make here.
I need to quickly say that
Yes.
I saw him, and in my brain I thought, isn't he dead?
Oscar Tully's also in the show. There's like a bunch of there's a bunch of the joke that Josh came on and was like, isn't it just Game of Thrones? And I was like, no, it's not Game of Thrones. And then they put a bunch of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon people on the show. I mean, there's only so many British actors willing to do fantasy, I guess. But I think what I like, this show also, there's two ways in which I think like where I see where the clunkiness of these episodes are coming. And one is the story has to be in service of something else that doesn't really matter in this show right now. And so that's really annoying because there's a big one that's like the thing that I know that the show is designed to do, which has not been said in Dune. So we can't really say it yet here, although we then are going to do it and we'll see. But the other piece is that like, if we had have done this more chronologically, that would have made sense. But I don't think the show wanted the show. Like, I give House of Dragon a lot of credit for what they did in season 1 of their show, which is they recast these main characters of the show after 4 episodes. And I actually think something similar here was kind of needed. If we're going to like go through the history and tell the story of these two sisters and how they get there, I think we were really done a disservice by like starting with them and like doing an exposition, then going forward, then going back. It's so clunky, but I think that they wanted to like have it be the Emily Watson and Olivia Williams show. So they had to show them at the beginning, and they needed them not just to be at the beginning of the show, they needed them to like be in all of these episodes in a way that I think like created a very disjointed timeline for this.
Yeah, and I'm the thing is I think the only thing I'm actually interested in is who is Travis Fimmel. Like,
and he was even in this episode.
That's my point though. Like they have not gotten me invested in these two sisters, like in a way that feels meaningful to me. And that's also frustrating. Like I would say the two of the main things I would be interested in a flashback for this show would have been number one, and I don't remember the names of the characters. The main character, whatever her name
Valya
is,
Harkonnen.
Valya. Why is she the way she is? That I'm interested in that. She's so ambitious. She's cutthroat. She wants to take over the whole universe with her influence. Why? How did she get that way? What makes her tick? What is her actual motivation? And the flashback did nothing for that. She was just the same
I have an
in
idea,
the very
Taran.
beginning of the flashback, as she always was. And her mother was like, yeah, you suck. I hate you. You're ambitious and you want to take over the universe. And it's like, how does one get there? Right?
What if we do a flashback from the flashback next time? What if we go
Right?
younger, go earlier?
And the number two, I would say, and more egregious, is how did she come up with the voice? And that also just existed. She was like, yeah, I just did it. And like, again, I'm not a lore expert on Dune, but I always kind of assumed that they like developed this skill over time, because the whole point of the Bene Gesserit is that they are like masters of their own body, right? And that they can like completely control their output of their own body, and then they're able to eventually control the output of like another person's body through their voice. And that they developed this, I assumed that they developed this skill through some sort of method, right? Like they figured this out. But no, it was just a thing that somebody was like, oh, I can do this. And they were like, oh, cool, evolution. And we don't even see like the moment of that happening. We're told about it. And I don't know if I needed to see it necessarily, but like she just,
you know why we couldn't see it? Because it would have been another flashback, Taran. I'm not even kidding that it would have been another flashback.
That's what I mean. I feel like the parts of the flashbacks that we were shown were not the parts that I cared about. And so like that was frustrating too. And it just made the voice seem so lame to me. That it was this very cool thing that I thought was this cool, but now it's just like, oh, she just could do it. And also she was just super ambitious. Like, I don't know, maybe if there's a twist at the end of the show and they're like, yeah, she actually secretly had some of that poison when she was a kid, and she got possessed by one of her ancestors that was this actual person, and that's why whatever. Cool. Okay, at least that's something, you know.
But there's another thing that I feel like last week we did this. We introduced a thing that tells us like you can talk to and commune with all the people you've ever been related to. But then they don't really use that to help us so even the cool way they could have like shown us some of this stuff, which is like we could have seen her save her brother, like get him to swim. We could have seen, all of these moments that we could have seen, but we just do it in kind of like the like more traditional flashback ways. Like as something is happening to a character, they are kind of like remembering stuff from their childhood. And I really do. Part of me feels like the stuff I liked from this episode, I would have liked just as much if I read them from a Wikipedia page, like how I like look up like cool stuff from history. I'm like, oh, it's kind of, it's cool. But then it wasn't like shown very well, and it's written so inconsistently. I don't mean that as I'm like it is the dialogue and the writing, but it's also just like I want to see the whiteboard of them being like, we'll do this and then we'll do this and then we'll go back here and then we'll do this, because I can't believe they like looked at that and were like, all right, that's how we'll do it. I do totally agree with you that part of I do hope that at some point I would hope that there is more to Valya and how she was able to do because you're right. The whole thing is like genetics and like picking, and deciding what happens to people. And so the idea that she might have not been like born with this, but is like, or she was, but that was like intentional, to me is interesting. I don't really think that's what we're gonna get. It does seem like it kind of feels like, Taran, I was watching my nieces. I have an 8-year-old niece and a 4-year-old niece, and sometimes they play with each other, and sometimes the 8-year-old is like, oh, like you're playing wrong. Like you're not playing right. And she's like, actually, this happens over here and this happened, because she's related to me, and so she's a control freak. And I kind of feel like that's what happened with they gave them a sandbox, to play in. And like, but you can only play with it in a certain way. So it's like, well, could we say how the voice got created? And they're like, kind of. you could kind of do that. You could kind of explain it, but not really explain it. And I just feel like the show is, yeah, just completely like, it just feels so clunky and unsatisfying, I think is the other piece to this. And but the interesting thing to me, Turner, is you were like, I just want to see more of Travis Fimmel and Desmond Hart. I will say, at the very least, the one thing I can say is that it is the thing with him that will then directly be like, oh yeah, that's how it's related to the movies later. So that is the one piece that's like, I don't know, at least there's that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not even that I don't want to like be confusing. Like I don't want to say like, oh, I just want to see more of Travis Fimmel. I want to be invested in the characters that the show is invested in. Like I want to care about their story. But I just feel like they haven't done that for me. And I feel like typically a flashback episode is one where like you would try to garner more sympathy or empathy for your characters, or like just some sort of like interest in your characters. And I just feel like they didn't really do that either. I do think the most interesting part of this episode was the murdering of the Atreides. But it still just didn't feel like it was just like, it was a cool moment. Like, oh, wait, there's Atreides. She's on a mission here. Oh, wait, she murdered all of them. Like, oh, but then she comes back and she's like, yeah, so I did it. It's like,
well, one thing that I think this show is missing, I think like missing the point to a degree on, which is there does seem to be this thing about, so in the movies, the Harkonnens are like undoubtedly pretty bad and evil. But there's also this way in which like Paul as the hero is set up like Frank Herbert felt like people didn't understand what he was trying to say in the first book. And then when you see Dune Messiah, you realize that there is this way in which there's this idea that Paul is the chosen one, right? And people are like, he's the chosen one. He's going to save us. It's the prophecy. He's going to do this thing. And Frank Herbert was basically trying to be like, here's the fallacies. This is what happens when you do that. When you put that there isn't like a white savior, that there isn't going to be this thing. And so Denis Villeneuve had to like come, like when he made Dune, he wanted to like emphasize what Frank Herbert felt like he fixed from Dune Messiah. And he tried to implement more of that. And I feel like you can feel that in the second Dune movie. All of that to be said, I feel like there's like all of this like shades of grayness happening where like, yeah, like Valya is both like super rich and her parents are kind of awful. They're Harkonnen. So I guess like, I don't know, but then she also is like bought into this movement that like is basically like, yeah, we're going to control and dictate how everybody does everything, blah, 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 blah. We know that she's going to use the voice and kill. She almost kills her parents, right? Like, but the show wants kind of it to like live in the shades of gray area in a way that I think is like kind of completely ineffective. I don't really know. I think in a way that I'm feeling like so detached from, I mean, more Valya than I think I am Tula, who I actually do think for the most part, other than that there's like a lot of things sort of like missing from, like there's not quite enough in the story to be like, okay, I'm completely getting it. But for the most part, she like when she does this thing against Atreides and then comes back and then gets yelled at, and she's kind of following Valya's lead and all of this stuff, like, and ultimately it leads to the decision at the end of the episode where like in the present time she's going to decide to do a thing that basically all other Bene Gesserit are against, which is she's going to try and use thinking technology to save this girl who she put through this trial. Like, there is an interesting idea in all of that, but it's just been pretty ineffective in terms of who I'm supposed to be rooting for. And there are good shows that I'm rooting for characters who are not good people. I don't think the show is like really having any sort of meaningful impact with any particular character.
And I think that's sort of what I was getting at in terms of Valya's motivation, or even Tula's for that matter, because Tula's motivation seemingly is Valya's motivation because she takes all of her orders from Valya. And I do think that Tula is perhaps a more interesting character, and one that maybe they should have focused more on if they weren't willing to sort of dive into Valya's thing. But like, you can certainly follow anti-heroes. You can follow and be invested in, even if you're not rooting for them, or maybe you're like conflicted about rooting for them. But like, you have to sort of understand what they're doing, what their goal is, and why, and get sort of like invested in that. And I don't know what Valya's even doing beyond just like more influence, more ambition. Like, does she think that she is helping stabilize the galaxy or whatever? Like, does she truly believe that? Because it doesn't seem like it. It seems like she just wanted revenge, but like, we didn't even see the thing that makes her want revenge. Like,
yeah,
it's just.
Can I interject it? Which is that I actually do think what Valya wants is actually pretty clear. I think in terms of like, she's been kicked out of being, Carino's like advisor, and she's like, okay, go back. Don't let that, like, make sure you don't lose control over any of the noble houses. I'm gonna fix this thing with Carino. We're gonna figure it out. And all of that is like part of the problem, I think, in the disconnect is that we don't really understand in particular why Valya would believe in that or want to do that. The literal only thing is a prophecy. But even then, I feel like the prophecy has been so vague about like, once born in blood, once, born again and twice born or whatever. But like, you're totally right there though, but I'm just like trying to articulate, like, we have no idea why does she in particular believe in like control. And I do think like a flashback to her childhood is actually a perfect time to try to implement some sort of thing where it shows why her idea of order and control at the behest of like at the expense of freedoms of other people, literally making people have babies the gender that they want them to be. Why is all of that stuff? How has she bought into that? And there's been no point in the show where they have told us this is why Valya Harkonnen is okay and buys into this freedom. We just have to believe that she does. And that's, I think,
like, in one episode of The Penguin, I understood the guy and what his motivations are, and why he's overlooked, and why he wants to achieve power and influence. And I was rooting for him in the way that you root for anti-heroes. In one episode of Sweet Pea, a show about like a woman who's a serial killer, I understood her motivation for murdering people as a serial killer and started rooting for her as a serial killer. Like, that's what I'm missing from these characters, where it's like, if you are going to be a character-based show in any meaningful way, I need to know who these people are and what is driving them, and not just know it, but feel it and be invested in it, I think is the important part. You can tell me she's ambitious. She wants to regain her status, or the Harkonnen status, or her status, or whatever the case may be. She's been overlooked because of what happened in the robot wars, and the Atreides cast their family down, and she wants to be important. Okay, let me feel that. Don't just tell me that's who she is. So yeah, that's, I think, a huge part of the issue that I'm having. We also end this episode on this thing, the thinking machines. We talked about it last week. How are the machines going to come into play? Is it a Desmond thing, or is it a Bene Gesserit thing? Turns out the Bene Gesserits are the ones using the machines. And that was like the biggest reveal of the episode. but it still kind of fell a little flat for me because I still don't really understand what is happening with it. And it was like, oh man, here's the big twist. She's not going to give up on the girl. I was like, yeah, I figured she wasn't dead. She would have been dead. You know? And
Yeah.
but she's using a machine to do it. It's like, oh, okay. So I guess they're using machines. Is that's the thing? She went and checked with the machine that we're doing the right plan. Okay. Okay, now what?
Yeah, I mean, again, this stuff is all in service of future movie stuff, so it's a little bit tricky for me because I feel like I'm going to end up spoiling two things, which I don't think is true because I think by the end of the
This
show
show and Dune Prophet and
and
Dune
Dune
Messiah.
Messiah, but then I feel like the whole point of the show is to like set us up for things that are.
It would be weird for this show to set up the movie because I would imagine that like 95% of the people that watch the movie will have not watched this show.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's spoiling. All it's doing is basically like what's going to happen is there's going to be a thing that happens in Dune Messiah. When you see it, you're going to be like, oh, it's like that thing in Dune Prophecy. And if you haven't watched Dune Prophecy, it won't matter. It won't matter whatsoever. But if you have watched it, you're going to be like, oh, I understand this a little more. Like this is really, I think, for people who like are wanting to really dive in. Unfortunately, I do feel like it's like not working in a way that like me who fell so hard for Dune and being like, oh man, I really want to love this. And there's certain things in here. I think the idea of these two sisters who have these two different approaches, we now know like in my head, this thing was going to be like sister civil war. But now that doesn't even seem to be totally what's happening because basically now that like in my head, we were going to get the reveal that Tula was going to be involved with a sect of Bene Gesserit, or at least like that was not connected to like what was the higher ups actually knew what was going on, therefore creating a rift between the way the Bene Gesserit could be if Tula had her way versus how if Valya had her way. But now that they're all like connected under one thing, it's like, oh, okay, sure. Like that to me, this is like so less interesting. So
Yeah, like last episode, I was like, oh well, they had to have included this like schism within the Bene Gesserits for a reason. Like they place so much importance on that. But now it's like, okay, well now I can see the world where they just put that there because like she's the bully that Valya has to defeat. You know what I mean? Like,
well, yeah, I mean that plus I think what you're gonna see is the way in which like what's happening with the Bene Gesserit 10,000 years ago. I don't think is going to be a thing that they continue to pursue. So like the thing in the movie is not Bene Gesserit stuff. So this using the thinking machines will, I think, probably prove to be a mistake. Is the way I think we're going. But that because they created the technology and moved this technology forward, that that then leads them vulnerable to it be used against them again. What feels insignificant is like, 10,000 years in the 10,000 years in the future. So who cares?
yeah, I think also it's just like I think one of the reasons why the thinking machine reveal fell flat to me was that like obviously there's plenty out there like tropes and stuff about the dangers of machines and AI, but like within the context of this show, they've done nothing to explain to me why this is bad beyond just people hate it and they had a war about it. Like there's been no actual content about like they just keep reminding you that thinking machines are bad. They're not like the theme of the show isn't like the dangers of AI. So like it's not being interwoven into what's happening or anything. So it's just like,
well, the other disconnect, Taran, is that the thing that's going to happen in Dune Messiah is not necessarily about thinking machine technology because that's like kind of a Frank Herbert like put it in but was not interested. He's just like, this is why all he did was basically be like, there isn't thinking technology. So now when we're in, I don't have to really, there's a way in which Dune actually feels kind of primitive despite being a futuristic sci-fi. So like knife fighting is just because you do have these like futuristic shields that can prevent like gunfire. And so the only way you can be skilled enough is to like penetrate the shield slow enough to be able to stab someone. That feels both futuristic and primitive, right? And that's kind of like what he and so he used this like, well, yeah, there aren't like, he didn't want to have to deal with like, here's my AI assistant who probably would be here if we continued on the trajectory of like AI as we thought it would be. So he just like came up, he's like, no, AI bad. War happened a long time ago. No thinking technology. And then Brian Herbert was like, what about that thinking technology? Like, what about that? And he's introduced this stuff. And so now they're kind of like, and some Dune historian, if you want, I'm pretty like fresh to Dune. So please, like in the comments below, like fact check me here. But it does feel like they're combining almost like two different things. It's a thing that Frank Herbert absolutely put into the books. And it's a thing that like his son like extrapolate on a very small thing that Frank Herbert did. And now they're trying to like mash them together because they set the story 10,000 years in the past. So then the AI thing feels more prescient. It's all kind of like it's all just a little messy.
Yeah. Well, what I will say is that I felt like I mentioned this before, but like the thing that worked the most for me in this episode was the massacring of the Atreides, because it did feel like they kind of took their time a little bit with that, at least, with like the introduction and the scenes with the family and the horse and setting up the poison. Like that felt like its own little contained story, which I thought was very effective, and I was like it definitely hit you, and they told it in the right way where they were hiding the fact that they were Atreides for a while, and then when you realize what was happening, you're like, oh, but then it's too late. And so I liked that. I thought that was fun, and like the kinds of psychological impacts that would have on a person. It felt like they kind of explored, like, would my brother be proud of this? I would hope that this was not just here as a reason for why she didn't kill the girl, or saved because I would believe that she saved the girl from the previous 2 episodes. I didn't need this story to be the reason she saves the girl. I still don't even understand why they need to kill the girl. Like, oh, sacrifice is necessary. I don't know. It's just vagueness. But
to get an answer, to find what were they looking for? See, this is bad too. I can't remember why did they make her do this? It's to figure, the prophecy, right? They want to figure
no, I
out
mean, once she's in a coma, like, why do you need to like pull the plug essentially? Like, why can't you just like keep her around, try some more things? But anyway, I did like that. I thought it was well done. This notion of like infiltrating, killing off this family. If this had been like a major plot point for the whole show, I probably would have been pretty happy with it. Like, what is the appropriate response to the situation that they were in? Did she go too far? It certainly seemed like it. They really hammered it home by him being like, it's chill that you're Harkonnen.
Yeah.
I did think it was a little weird that she like killed the guy she loved, but spared the kid.
He has, I guess, like he has no power. Like she has power, right? She has. I would not be surprised for the kid. I mean,
I figured he was like the guy in the show now.
Oh, Desmond, that's fun.
No, the swordmaster.
Oh, the other Atreides. Oh yeah, that could be Kieran Atreides. Can I say that I did think for the flashback stuff, the look of it is kind of everything I was like looking for in terms of like when you set a show in the past and it looks different. It felt like primitive, and like the scene where they're just like harvesting up some like whale thing. I thought like it just looked really good. At least it like was so different than what I had been seeing. I was like, all right, it actually is a different time and place, at least. Only because it's rural, not because it's like set in a different time period, seemingly. Again, I thought that the show like looks incredible. The scene where they're like training and meditating in the rain, I thought like all of it, like there's some cool looking stuff in this show. It's just a little bit of like style over substance. So far, 3 episodes and halfway through, Taran.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I just don't know how interested I am in the rest of it at this point.
Well, yeah, the thing here, I think we could just say this, like, we were a little bit after episode 1 being like, should we keep recapping about this? So we will let people know if we're going to keep recapping it, but we do not want to come on here and just feel like we're complaining about a show for 35, 45 minutes. So if the next episode, I think both feel similarly like, I think probably the next time you will hear, we'll put out a little update in the feed, probably say like, hey, but most likely what would happen is we would return after the finale. So we shall see about that. I just don't, I hope folks can understand that we'd be in a little bit of a weird spot about, and it would just feel not fun to come on and complain about the television.
Yeah,
show.
if you're covering a show that you're not enjoying, the people who don't enjoy the show are not listening to your podcast because they're not watching it. And the people that do enjoy the show don't want to hear you complain about it. And when you don't enjoy the show, you don't particularly want to talk about it. So
Yeah, just
it feels
peeling the
like
curtain
from
a little
all
bit here,
angles.
but yeah. Yeah. I mostly think my real feeling is that I do feel like, unfortunately, this is something, and there was a really interesting thing that somebody was going through. I think they were actually doing this on one of the Ringer podcasts. If you look at sort of how this show ended up becoming what it is, like if we just look back, the original plan was Denis Villeneuve was going to make this show, and he was on board, and then obviously he just started working on Dune 2 and did not have the time to do it, and so he ended up pulling out. Then it was an entirely different set of folks. So I'm trying to see Johan Renck, who is known for Chernobyl, was going to be working on the show. He dropped out. And they had another, and then Alison Shaper came on to be the showrunner. That, to me, I think you can kind of like feel that, like it being like put through a lot of things to end up being what it is. And I think that this show would have been, I mean, this would have been so much better if it was Denis Villeneuve being there. I also do think, like, I don't want to like completely write off Alison Shaper and her ability as a showrunner, because this, to me, I feel like it can feel all of the hands in the pot here of like people like being involved in this and being like, that guy has to be Atreides and this guy has to be that and has to connect to this and it's going to connect to that in a way that I think is just a real challenge. And I think like when you can pull off this like IP franchise stuff in a way where it actually, you produce something that feels quite impressive. I think the Penguin, honestly, is maybe one of the better examples we've had recently of something that was kind of able to pull off this magic trick of not only was it self-contained and really good and strong and compelling and an interesting story, at the end of it, they literally did this one thing that was like, oh, and now it connects. Which is they throw the bat signal. Spoiler for the end of the Penguin, but they put it up, and I'm like, that's literally all I needed. This feels like there's too much going on to make this like work in the way I would like it to work. So it's unfortunate. I was really looking forward to Dune Prophecy.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe it will land the plane, Taran. Maybe.
You know, I'm still mildly interested in what Desmond is about, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm less interested now.
We'll see. I think that's our recap of Dune Prophecy episode 3. Anything else, Taran, before we go? Anything else you want to?
That's it.
Check us out on the Tastemakers. Make sure you subscribe to We Know Scripted TV, and we may or may not be back. Certainly be back after the finale, and we'll let folks know if we're going to continue to cover Dune Prophecy. Until next time, bye bye.